The rain had not stopped for 11 days. It fell in sheets across the devastated landscape of the Somme, turning the earth into a churning sea of mud that swallowed boots, rifles, and occasionally entire men. Lieutenant James Hartley stood at the edge of what remained of the support trench, staring across no man's land toward the German lines barely visible through the downpour. His orders sat folded in his breast pocket, already soaked through despite the oilcloth wrapper. He had read them 3 times, each reading confirming what he had hoped was a clerical error. His platoon was to relieve the garrison at Blood Trench 14. Every man in the British Expeditionary Force knew the stories. Blood Trench 14 was a forward position captured from the Germans 6 months prior, a stretch of earthworks roughly 400 yards long that jutted closer to enemy lines than any other Allied position in the sector. 3 relief units had been sent there in as many months. None had returned. Command attributed the losses to artillery bombardment, enemy raids, or desertion. The soldiers knew better. They spoke in whispers of patrols that went out and never came back, of sentries found at their posts with their throats torn open but no enemy footprints in the mud, of voices calling from the darkness in perfect English, begging to be let back in. Hartley turned to face his men. 23 soldiers, most of them barely old enough to shave, huddled against the trench wall under whatever scraps of canvas or corrugated tin they had managed to scavenge. They looked up at him with hollow eyes, faces caked with mud and exhaustion. Private Dockery, a farm boy from Yorkshire, was methodically cleaning his rifle for the 3rd time that hour. Corporal Webb sat with his head in his hands, shoulders shaking slightly. Sergeant Pierce stood beside Hartley, his weathered face unreadable beneath the grime. "We move out at dusk," Hartley announced. His voice carried no conviction. "Full kit. We are taking over defensive positions at Section 14 forward. Expected duration is 72 hours before relief." No one spoke. Several of the men exchanged glances. Private Dockery stopped cleaning his rifle, the rag hanging limply from his fingers. Finally, Private Mason, a wiry Londoner with a reputation for speaking out of turn, cleared his throat. "Sir, that is Blood Trench, is it not? The one where Hathaway's company went missing?" Lieutenant Hartley met his gaze. "Those are our orders, Private. Captain Hathaway's unit was caught in a bombardment. We are soldiers of the King. We go where we are ordered." But no one had heard any bombardment. The night Hathaway's company disappeared, the line had been quiet. Men in adjacent trenches reported only silence from Section 14 after nightfall, then screaming around midnight, then silence again. When a runner was sent at dawn to investigate, he found the trench empty. Rifles still stacked. Helmets still hanging on posts. Personal effects untouched. The only unusual detail was the mud. The walls of the trench had been torn open in places, as if something had burrowed through from the other side. Deep gouges in the earth that looked almost like claw marks, though no one wanted to suggest what might have made them. Hartley had seen the official report. It was 3 sentences long and signed by a colonel who had never visited the front. Enemy action. Mass desertion suspected. Investigation ongoing. The investigation, Hartley knew, would never conclude. The army did not like mysteries that undermine morale. Better to classify the men as deserters than admit something unexplainable was happening in the forward trenches. They set out as the sun began its descent behind the banks of storm clouds. The route to Blood Trench 14 was a nightmare of communication trenches flooded knee-deep with water that stank of decay and chemicals. They passed several exhausted units heading in the opposite direction, soldiers with the 1,000-yard stare who did not meet their eyes or return their greetings. At one junction they found the body of a runner face down in the water, his message pouch still strapped to his back. No one had bothered to pull him out. Hartley ordered 2 men to retrieve the body, but when they tried to lift him, the corpse came apart in their hands, the flesh already liquefying in the contaminated water. Private Dockery vomited against the trench wall. They reached Blood Trench 14 as full darkness fell. The position was exactly as described in the briefing reports, a long earthwork reinforced with duckboards and sandbags, fire steps built into the forward wall, traverses every 20 yards to contain blast damage from artillery. Dugouts had been carved into the rear wall, shallow caves reinforced with timber and canvas. Everything appeared intact and ready for occupation. But the trench was utterly silent. No sentries called out challenges. No sounds of men settling in for the night. Just the constant drum of rain and the distant rumble of artillery to the south. Hartley raised his hand, signaling his platoon to halt. He could feel his heart hammering against his ribs. Something was profoundly wrong. The air itself felt heavy, oppressive, as if the darkness here had physical weight. Sergeant Pierce moved up beside him, rifle at the ready. His breath came in short bursts, fogging in the cold air. "Sir, there should be someone here. Even if Hathaway's men are gone, command would have posted a relief." Hartley nodded slowly. He was about to order the platoon forward when Private Mason pointed toward one of the dugouts. His hand was shaking. "Sir, there. In the entrance." Hartley followed his gaze. A helmet sat in the dugout entrance, perfectly positioned as if someone had just set it down. But there was something wrong with it. Even in the darkness, Hartley could see the dark stains covering the metal, running down onto the sandbags below. He moved closer, raising his electric torch. The beam caught the helmet's interior, revealing a mass of congealed matter that might have been blood and brain tissue. The straps were still fastened, as if it had been torn violently from someone's head while still buckled under the chin. Hartley felt his stomach lurch. He swept the torch beam across the trench. More helmets. More abandoned equipment. A rifle leaning against the wall with the bayonet still fixed, the blade bent at an impossible angle. A pair of boots standing upright in the mud, laces still tied but nothing inside them. Personal items scattered everywhere, photographs and letters turning to pulp in the rain, identity discs glinting in the torchlight. The platoon spread out along the trench, each man finding some fresh horror. Private Dockery discovered a journal lying open on a fire step, the pages covered in frantic handwriting. He picked it up carefully, trying to shield it from the rain. "Sir, you should see this." Hartley took the journal. The writing was nearly illegible, the ink running, but he could make out enough to feel ice forming in his gut. The final entry was dated 2 days prior. It read, "They come up through the mud when the sun goes down. They look like us but they are not us. They know our names. They know our voices. Jenkins went out to meet his brother and we heard him screaming, but when we looked there was just mud where he had been standing. The mud is moving. God help us, the mud is moving." The entry ended mid-sentence, the final words trailing off into an illegible smear. Sergeant Pierce was reading over his shoulder. His face had gone pale. "Sir, we cannot stay here. This is not a defensible position. This is a grave." Hartley wanted to agree. Every instinct screamed at him to turn the platoon around and march back to the support lines, orders be damned. But he was an officer in His Majesty's army, and his duty was clear. He closed the journal and tucked it into his pack. "We have our orders, Sergeant. Post sentries at each traverse. Full watch rotation. No man goes anywhere alone. We hold this position until relief arrives." The men set about the grim business of preparing the trench for occupation, though their movements were mechanical, driven by training rather than conviction. They cleared the worst of the debris, stacked arms, distributed ammunition. Private Dockery found a functioning Primus stove and managed to heat water for tea, though no one had much appetite. As they worked, Hartley could not shake the feeling that they were being watched. Several times he spun around, certain he had seen movement in his peripheral vision, but there was nothing. Only mud and rain and darkness. Night settled over Blood Trench 14 like a burial shroud. The first watch passed without incident, though none of the sentries reported feeling at ease. Private Mason, posted at the northern traverse, claimed he could hear digging sounds coming from beneath the duckboards, a rhythmic scraping that seemed to follow him as he paced his post. When Sergeant Pierce investigated, they found nothing unusual, but Mason insisted the sound had been real, had been close, had sounded almost deliberately timed to his footsteps. At midnight, Hartley sat in what had been the command dugout, trying to compose a status report by candlelight. The space was cramped and damp, the ceiling barely high enough to stand upright. Previous occupants had scratched messages into the wooden support beams. Most were the usual soldier graffiti, names and dates and crude jokes. But one message, carved deeper than the others, caught his attention. "Do not trust the voices. They are not your friends. They are wearing your friends." He was still staring at those words when Corporal Webb appeared in the entrance, his face drawn with fear. "Sir, you need to come." "No." Hartley grabbed his rifle and followed Webb to the eastern fire step. Half the platoon was already gathered there, staring out into no man's land. At first, Hartley saw nothing unusual, just the familiar wasteland of shell craters and wire. Then the flare went up. Someone from another position had fired an illumination round, and for 30 seconds the battlefield was bathed in harsh white light. That was when Hartley saw them. Figures moving through no man's land, dozens of them, advancing in a rough skirmish line toward the trench. They moved with an odd, jerking gait, their uniforms hanging in tatters. As the flare drifted lower, Hartley could make out more details that made his blood run cold. They were British soldiers. He could see their uniforms clearly, the same khaki as his own men wore. But something was terribly wrong. Their movements were too stiff, too mechanical. Several were missing limbs but continued advancing regardless. One figure dragged itself forward with only its arms, its lower body a trailing mess of mud and torn flesh. Another walked upright despite having no head, its hands outstretched as if feeling its way forward. The flare died, plunging the battlefield back into darkness. For a moment no one spoke. Then Private Dockery broke the silence with a whisper. "Those were our boys. Those were British uniforms." Sergeant Pierce had his rifle raised, tracking the space where the figures had been. "They cannot be real. It is not possible." But Hartley knew better. He had spent 2 years in these trenches. He had seen gas attacks and flamethrowers and men driven mad by artillery. He knew what was real and what was nightmare. These things, whatever they were, existed. They were out there right now, advancing through the darkness toward Blood Trench 14. "Stand to," he ordered, his voice steady despite the terror clawing at his chest. "Full defensive positions. Fix bayonets. No one fires until I give the order." The men scrambled to comply, lining the fire step with rifles pointed toward the enemy. The rain continued its relentless assault, drumming against helmets and running in streams down the trench walls. Minutes passed. 5, 10. The tension stretched to breaking point. Several men were shaking so badly they could barely hold their weapons. Then the voices began. They came from the darkness beyond the wire, calling out in perfect English accents. Names. Dozens of names. Hartley heard his own name called, heard his mother's voice asking him to come home. He heard Private Dockery gasp as someone called for him, using his childhood nickname that only his sister knew. All along the line, men stiffened or cried out as they heard impossible voices calling to them from the mud. "Tommy, help me. I'm stuck in the wire." "James, it is me, it is Michael. I need you to open the gate. Please, please let me in, I'm so cold out here." The voices were perfect. The inflections, the accents, the intimate knowledge they displayed. Hartley could see men wavering, see them lowering their rifles, see the desperate hope flickering in their eyes that maybe, somehow, their missing friends or brothers had survived and were out there needing rescue. "Do not respond," Hartley shouted. "Do not acknowledge them. They are not real. They are not your mates." But Private Wilson had already moved toward the trench ladder. His face was slack with wonder. "That is my brother. That is Henry. He was reported missing 3 months ago. He is alive." Sergeant Pierce grabbed Wilson by the webbing and hauled him back. "That is not your brother, son. Your brother is dead. Whatever is out there is wearing his voice like a mask." Wilson struggled, tears streaming down his face. "But I can hear him. He is calling for me. He needs help." The voices grew louder, more insistent. More men began to move toward the ladders. The discipline was breaking down. Hartley realized with horror that his platoon was about to throw itself into the darkness, charging blindly toward whatever horrors waited in the mud. He had seconds to act. He raised his service revolver and fired 3 shots into the air. The sharp cracks echoed across the battlefield, momentarily drowning out the voices. Every man froze, shocked back to awareness. "The next man who moves toward that ladder will be shot for desertion in the face of the enemy," Hartley announced. "I will not lose this entire platoon to whatever trick is being played on us. We hold this position. We do not go into the dark. That is an order." The men slowly returned to their posts, though several were openly weeping. The voices continued for another hour, growing more desperate, more pleading. Then, as abruptly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse. Dawn came slowly, the sky lightening to a sickly gray. As visibility increased, Hartley ordered a careful inspection of the wire in front of the trench. What they found confirmed his worst fears. Dozens of bodies hung in the wire, British soldiers in various states of decay. But they were not the victims of some recent attack. These men had been dead for months, their uniforms rotted, their flesh falling from their bones. Yet all of them were positioned facing the trench, arms outstretched, mouths open as if frozen mid-scream or mid-plea. And every single one of them had been moved during the night. The mud around each corpse was freshly disturbed. They had not been hanging in the wire when the platoon arrived. They had crawled there in the darkness, had positioned themselves while the voices called out, waiting for someone to come close enough to grab. Private Dockery was violently sick. Several other men turned away, unable to look. Hartley felt something fundamental shift in his understanding of the world. These were not enemy soldiers. These were not the victims of artillery or gas. These men had been taken, dragged down into the mud and transformed into something else, something that wore their faces and knew their memories but was no longer human. He thought of Captain Hathaway's missing company. He thought of all the patrols that had disappeared from this section of the line. He understood now that they had never left. They were still here, buried in the mud, waiting for darkness to rise again. Sergeant Pierce appeared at his elbow. "Sir, we need to evacuate this position. We need to report what we have seen." Hartley nodded. But even as he agreed, he knew it would make no difference. Who would believe them? What report could possibly capture the reality of what they had witnessed? And more importantly, would command even allow them to leave? Blood Trench 14 had to be held. The strategic map said so. The generals in their chateaus 50 miles behind the lines said so. The dead men rotting in the wire had thought the same thing. He was about to order the platoon to prepare for withdrawal when Private Mason shouted from the southern traverse. "Sir, movement in the communication trench. Someone is coming." Hartley felt a spike of hope. Perhaps their relief had arrived early. Perhaps command had realized the danger and was sending reinforcements. He moved to meet the approaching figures, Sergeant Pierce following close behind. 3 men emerged from the communication trench, moving slowly, deliberately. They wore British uniforms, clean and relatively unmudded despite the conditions. Their faces were pale, expressionless. The lead man carried a dispatch case. He stopped 10 feet from Hartley and stood motionless, staring with eyes that did not blink despite the falling rain. "Lieutenant Hartley," the figure said. His voice was flat, emotionless. "We are here to deliver new orders." Something about the man's tone made Hartley's skin crawl. He kept his rifle at the ready, suddenly very aware that these men had approached without being challenged by any sentries, had materialized as if from nowhere. "Who sent you? What unit are you from?" The figure tilted its head slightly, like a dog trying to understand a sound. "We are from command. You are ordered to hold this position until relieved. You will not withdraw. You will not retreat. You will remain in Blood Trench 14. The other 2 figures had begun to move, spreading out to flank Hartley and Pierce. Their movements were too smooth, too coordinated. No soldier moved like that, with such perfect synchronization. Sergeant Pierce brought his rifle up. "Sir, these are not our men." The lead figure's mouth opened wider than should have been possible, the jaw unhinging like a snake's. From inside came a sound like wind through a tunnel, a hollow rushing that might have been laughter. Then all 3 figures lunged forward simultaneously. Hartley fired twice, both shots catching the lead figure's center mass. The impacts knocked it backward, but it did not fall, did not react to being shot. Instead it straightened, looked down at the spreading bloodstains on its tunic, then resumed its advance. Pierce fired as well, then the other sentries opened up, the confined space of the trench erupting with gunfire. The bullets tore through the 3 figures, shredding uniforms and flesh, but they did not stop. They did not slow. They reached the nearest soldiers with arms outstretched, and Hartley watched in horror as Private Wilson was seized by the throat. The thing that had been a messenger lifted Wilson off his feet with inhuman strength and began to drag him toward the trench wall. But not over it. Into it. The mud itself seemed to open, becoming liquid, and Wilson's boots sank into the earthen wall as if it were quicksand. He screamed, thrashing, but the grip was unbreakable. His legs disappeared into the mud up to his knees, then his waist. He clawed desperately at the sandbags, but his fingers found no purchase. The thing holding him maintained its grip as it too began to sink into the wall, merging with the earth, pulling Wilson down with it. "Bayonets," Hartley roared. "Fix bayonets and drive them back." The platoon surged forward with cold steel. The bayonets seemed to have more effect than bullets, as if the iron itself repelled whatever animated these corpses. Pierce drove his blade into the chest of one figure and twisted, and the thing finally released its victim and stumbled backward. But Wilson was already waist-deep in the mud, sinking fast, his screams becoming muffled as the earth rose around his chest. Hartley grabbed Wilson's arms and pulled with all his strength, bracing his boots against the duckboards. For a moment he thought he might succeed, but then he felt other hands in the mud, dozens of hands all pulling from below. Wilson's eyes met his, wide with terror and understanding. He knew he was lost. "Tell my mother," Wilson gasped. "Tell her I fought." Then the mud closed over his face and he was gone, dragged down into the earth as completely as if he had never existed. The surface of the trench wall rippled once, twice, then became still. The 3 messengers had been driven back by the concentrated bayonet assault, retreating into the communication trench from which they had emerged. But Hartley knew they would return. He also knew that Wilson was not dead, not yet. He was somewhere beneath their feet, trapped in the mud with whatever had taken him. Hartley could hear faint sounds through the earth, muffled screaming and tearing noises that made his imagination conjure horrors he could not fully articulate. The platoon regrouped, wild-eyed and panting. They had lost 1 man and gained the certain knowledge that this trench was a death trap. Hartley made a decision. We are leaving. Withdraw to the communication trench. Standard fighting retreat. We move now. But when they reached the junction where they had entered Blood Trench 14, they found the way blocked. The walls of the communication trench had collapsed, filling the passage with tons of mud and debris. No bombardment had caused this. No artillery had fallen nearby. The trench had simply closed, sealing them in. Sergeant Pierce examined the collapse with mounting desperation. We can dig through. If we all work together, we can clear it in a few hours. Hartley knew they did not have hours. He knew that when darkness fell, the things in the mud would rise again, and this time there would be far more of them. He could feel it, a certainty in his bones. They had disturbed something here, and it was not going to let them leave. The platoon spent the day in frantic activity, half the men digging at the collapsed trench while the others maintained watch. They made almost no progress. For every shovelful of mud they removed, more seemed to flow in from the sides. It was like trying to dig through water. Private Dockery, working at the face of the collapse, suddenly dropped his shovel and stumbled backward, his face white with horror. There is someone in here. I felt a hand. There is someone buried in this mud. Several men began to dig more frantically, trying to reach whoever was trapped. But as they dug, more hands emerged from the mud. Dozens of hands. Hundreds. All reaching, grasping, pulling at the diggers. The men fell back in panic and the hands withdrew, sliding back into the earth like worms returning to soil. The platoon abandoned the effort. There would be no escape that way. Hartley gathered his remaining men in the command dugout. 22 soldiers, exhausted and terrified, waiting for nightfall. He tried to think of some words of encouragement, some officer's speech that would stiffen their resolve. But what could he say? They all knew the truth. They were trapped in a mass grave with things that had once been soldiers, and when the sun set, those things would rise again. Private Mason spoke up, his voice hoarse. Sir, what are they? The things in the mud. What are we fighting? Hartley thought about the question. He thought about the bodies in the wire, the hands in the collapsed trench, the messengers who had taken bullets without flinching. He thought about the journal entry about the patrols that had disappeared, about the official reports that classified it all as enemy action or desertion. I do not know, he admitted, but I know they were like us once. British soldiers holding this position. I think something here killed them and now they are trapped, forced to relive their deaths every night. And they want company. They want us to join them. Private Dockery was shaking. How do we fight them? How do we kill something that is already dead? We do not, Hartley said quietly. We survive. We hold out until dawn. If we can last through one more night, command will have to send someone to investigate our silence. They will have to acknowledge something is wrong. Maybe that will be enough. He did not believe his own words. Command had already ignored 3 missing units. What was one more platoon? They were expendable. The army had millions of men. It could afford to lose a few dozen to whatever dwelt in Blood Trench 14. As the sun began to set, they prepared the defenses as best they could. They gathered all the spare ammunition, distributed grenades, fixed bayonets. They built small fires in the dugouts, reasoning that the light might help somehow. They posted sentries at every traverse. And they waited. The transformation began at the moment full darkness fell. The mud began to move. All along the trench, the walls started to ripple and pulse like living tissue. The duckboards beneath their feet shifted and cracked. And then the hands came up. They emerged from the floor, the walls, even the ceiling of the dugouts. Dead white hands covered in grave mud, reaching and grasping. A hand seized Private Dockery's ankle and he screamed, hacking at it with his trenching tool until it released him. But more hands followed and more until the entire trench seemed to writhe with them. The dead began to pull themselves from the earth. They came up through the duckboards, tearing the planks aside with supernatural strength. They emerged from the trench walls, stepping out of the mud as if through doorways. And they were not just the recent dead. Some wore uniforms from the early days of the war. Some wore German gray instead of British khaki. Some wore no uniforms at all, just rotted cloth and exposed bone, men who had been in this earth for months or even years. They all shared one characteristic. They all moved with terrible purpose toward the living. The platoon opened fire, but there were too many targets and the dead did not react to bullets. Hartley shot one figure 3 times in the head before it finally collapsed, only to watch 2 more claw their way from the earth where it fell. Sergeant Pierce had grabbed a Mills bomb and thrown it into a cluster of advancing corpses. The explosion shredded them but did not stop them. The pieces continued to crawl forward, hands dragging torsos, severed arms clawing at the duckboards. Fall back to the command dugout, Hartley ordered. Fighting retreat. Do not let them separate us. The platoon battled its way along the trench, step by terrible step. They lost 3 more men in that withdrawal. Private Mason was pulled down through the duckboards despite 4 men trying to hold him. He managed one last scream before the mud flowed over his face. 2 other soldiers simply vanished during the chaos, there one moment and gone the next, dragged into the wall so quickly no one saw exactly how. They reached the command dugout and collapsed inside, slamming the timber door and bracing it with whatever they could find. 19 men left now, pressed together in a space meant for half that number. They could hear the dead outside, scratching at the door, pressing against the walls. The timber beams supporting the ceiling began to groan and flex as something pushed against them from above. Private Dockery was crying silently, clutching his rifle. "We are going to die here. We are all going to die here." Hartley wanted to deny it, but he could not find the words. The scratching at the door grew louder, more insistent. The timber was beginning to splinter. Then he remembered the journal he had found, the one with the warning about the voices. He pulled it from his pack and began flipping through the pages, searching for anything that might help. Most of the entries were incoherent, but near the beginning he found something that made him pause. The writer, a lieutenant named Carver from Hathaway's company, had written, "The chaplain said this ground is cursed. He said there was a battle here years ago, maybe centuries, and the dead were never properly buried. He said the earth remembers violence. He said blood and mud have mixed here so many times that the boundary between the living and the dead has worn thin. He said we should not have dug trenches here. We should have left this ground undisturbed." Hartley read the passage aloud. Several men were listening now, desperate for any explanation. Sergeant Pierce nodded slowly. "I have heard of such places. Battlefields where too many died. The ground becomes poisoned with death. So what do we do?" Private Dockery demanded. "How do we fight cursed ground?" "We do not," Hartley said, the realization dawning on him. "We cannot fight this. But maybe we do not have to. Maybe we just have to last until dawn. The journal says they come up when the sun goes down. It implies they return to the earth when the sun rises." It was a thin hope, but it was all they had. The night stretched on like a descent into hell. The dead pressed against the dugout from all sides, an inexorable tide that could not be stopped or reasoned with. The timber door splintered and broke. Sergeant Pierce and 3 others held the entrance with bayonets, stabbing at any hand or face that appeared in the gap. The blades worked, driving the dead back, but the defenders were exhausting themselves. They could not maintain this defense until dawn. Hartley tried to think strategically, but his mind kept circling back to the same terrible truth. They were surrounded by an army of corpses in a trench that had become a mass grave. Every man who had died here was now part of that army. And when his platoon died, they would rise again too, adding their numbers to the nightmare. Blood Trench 14 was a perfect trap, feeding on the living and growing stronger with each kill. The ceiling above them suddenly burst inward. A torrent of mud poured through, and with it came more of the dead. They dropped into the dugout, crawling and grasping. The confined space became a chaotic melee. Hartley found himself fighting hand-to-hand with something that had once been a British officer, its uniform still bearing captain's insignia. The thing's fingers were unnaturally strong, closing around his throat with crushing force. He drove his trench knife up under its jaw, through the soft tissue and into the brain cavity. It finally released him and collapsed. But in the chaos, more men were being pulled down. He watched Private Dockery disappear into a pile of writhing corpses, watched them drag him through the mud floor like wolves dragging down prey. Dockery's screams were cut short as the earth closed over him. Corporal Webb went next, pulled into the wall so violently that his arm tore off at the shoulder. The appendage lay twitching on the ground while Webb was consumed by the mud. Hartley realized they could not hold the dugout. "We have to get out. Back to the trench. Stay together and keep moving." The survivors burst from the dugout into the trench proper, which had become a hellscape. The dead filled the position from one end to the other, a shambling mass of animated corpses in various states of decay. Some still looked nearly human. Others were little more than skeletons held together by scraps of tendon and rotted uniform. They all moved with the same jerky determination, converging on the handful of living men. The platoon formed a tight circle, bayonets outward, and began to fight their way south along the trench. It was brutal, exhausting work. For every corpse they destroyed, 2 more rose from the mud to replace it. Men were falling, not all to the enemy. Some simply collapsed from exhaustion or terror, and were immediately swarmed by the dead. Hartley found himself fighting beside Sergeant Pierce. The old sergeant's face was set in grim determination, his movements economical and practiced. He had been in these trenches since 1914, had survived battles that killed entire battalions. He was not going to die here if he could help it. Sir, Pierce gasped between blows. I do not think we can kill them all. I think we need to get out of the trench entirely. Cross no man's land. The idea was madness. No man's land was a killing ground, swept by machine guns from both sides. But Hartley realized Pierce was right. Staying in the trench meant death. Their only chance was to leave it, even if that meant facing German fire. To the ladders, Hartley shouted. Everyone over the top. Head for the German lines. It was the last thing anyone expected to hear from an officer. Several men hesitated, but then more of the dead rose around them and the choice became clear. Die in the trench or take their chances in the open. They scrambled up the ladders and over the parapet, leaving the trenches behind. The moment they emerged into no man's land, a flare went up from the German positions. Then another. The British soldiers were suddenly illuminated, standing in the open between the lines. Hartley waited for the machine guns to open up, for the slaughter to begin. But the Germans did not fire. Instead, Hartley heard voices calling out in German from the enemy trenches. Warnings. Terrified warnings. He did not speak German well, but he caught enough to understand. The Germans were yelling at them to go back, to get away from that section of trench. They were not firing because they knew. They knew what dwelt in Blood Trench 14. Then the ground behind them erupted. The dead came up from the mud of no man's land itself, rising in a wave. They had followed the platoon out of the trench, followed them into the open. And now Hartley could see the full scope of the horror. There were hundreds of them. Thousands. The entire battlefield was a grave, and all the corpses were waking up. They came from shell craters and collapsed dugouts, from beneath tangles of wire and piles of rubble. British soldiers and German soldiers, their national uniforms meaning nothing in death. Some were fresh kills, barely dead a day. Others were ancient, wearing uniforms from wars that predated even this conflict. Hartley saw armor. He saw men in clothing that belonged in museums. The chaplain had been right. This ground had been a battlefield for centuries, and every dead warrior was waking. Run, Pierce shouted, and they ran. They sprinted across no man's land, a handful of living men fleeing before an army of the dead. The German soldiers in their trenches watched in horror, some making the sign of the cross. No shots were fired. The machine guns remained silent. Even in war, even between enemies, some things transcended hostility. But the dead were faster than they should have been. The fresher corpses could run, and they were gaining. Hartley felt fingers brush his back, heard breathing directly behind him. He spun and fired his revolver point blank into a German corpse that had been reaching for him. It stumbled but kept coming. He fired again and the thing's skull exploded, finally dropping it. They were not going to make it to the German lines. The dead were everywhere now, rising from the ground on all sides. The platoon was being herded, driven toward a particular spot in no man's land. Hartley realized with sick certainty that the dead were not just chasing them. They were surrounding them, boxing them in, driving them toward the one place they did not want to go. Blood Trench 14 lay ahead, a dark gash in the earth. The dead were forcing them back toward it. Pierce saw it too. They are trying to get us back in the trench. That is where they are strongest. Where the mud is deepest. Then we break through their line, Hartley said. We charge northeast, toward that shell crater. On my mark. He did not wait for acknowledgement. There was no time. He simply ran, firing his revolver into the mass of dead ahead, and his men followed. They hit the line of corpses like a wedge, bayonets fixed, momentum carrying them through. Bodies fell around them. Hands grasped and tore. Private Benson went down screaming. Then Private Crawford. The line was thinning rapidly, but they were through. They had broken the encirclement. Hartley counted 6 men still running beside him. 6 out of 23. The rest were gone, pulled into the mud or torn apart by the dead. He tried not to think about what would happen to them, whether they too would rise when the transformation took hold. They reached the shell crater and threw themselves into it, landing in 3 feet of filthy water. The crater offered at least some cover, the steep sides providing a defensive position. They climbed the far slope and took aim back toward Blood Trench 14. The dead had stopped advancing. They stood in a rough semicircle around the crater, just watching. Waiting. Sergeant Pierce was gasping for breath beside Hartley. Why have they stopped? Why are they not coming for us? Hartley understood then. Dawn was coming. He could see the faintest lightening of the sky to the east. The dead knew they were running out of time. They had failed to drag the living back into the trench before sunrise. Now they would have to return to the earth empty-handed. As the sun broke the horizon, Hartley watched the dead begin to sink back into the mud. They did not turn away or retreat in any normal sense. They simply descended, their bodies becoming liquid, merging with the earth. In less than a minute, the battlefield was empty again. No sign remained of the thousands of corpses that had been hunting them moments before. The survivors sat in stunned silence, unable to fully process what they had witnessed. Finally, Sergeant Pierce spoke. "Sir, we have to report this. Command has to know." Hartley nodded slowly. But he was thinking about the official reports he had read, the ones that dismissed the disappearances as enemy action or desertion. He was thinking about how his own report would sound. How it would be received by colonels and generals who had never set foot in these trenches. They would not believe him. Or worse, they would believe him and classify the report, bury it in some archive where it would never see light. Because acknowledging the truth would mean acknowledging that there were things in this war beyond bullets and gas and artillery. It would mean admitting that some ground could not be taken, some positions could not be held, no matter how many men you sent. They made their way back to the British lines as the sun climbed higher, walking openly across no man's land. The German positions remained silent. When they finally stumbled into a communication trench held by the Royal Welsh Fusiliers, the sentries nearly shot them. 6 muddy, blood-soaked men appearing out of no man's land at dawn looked like nothing good. The captain in charge of the section took one look at them and sent for the provost marshal. "Deserters," he said flatly. "Probably ran from their position." Hartley tried to explain. He told them about Blood Trench 14, about the orders to relieve the garrison, about what they had found there. But the words sounded insane even to his own ears. Dead men rising from the mud. Voices calling from the darkness. An entire battlefield of animated corpses. The captain's face grew harder with each sentence. "You are telling me your platoon abandoned their position because of ghost stories?" The captain's voice was icy. "Do you understand the penalty for desertion in the face of the enemy?" "We did not desert," Sergeant Pierce interjected. "We were driven from an untenable position by enemy action." "What enemy? Where is your contact report? Where are your casualties?" The captain gestured toward them. "You are covered in mud, but I see no wounds. Where are the rest of your men?" Hartley could not answer that. 13 men gone, pulled into the earth, but there would be no bodies to recover. No proof except the testimony of 6 shell-shocked survivors. They were held under guard while messengers were sent to brigade headquarters. Hours passed. Hartley sat with his remaining men in a dugout, under the watchful eye of armed sentries. No one spoke. What was there to say? They had survived the night, but survival had come at a cost they were still calculating. Late in the afternoon, an officer arrived from headquarters. A major, fresh-faced and clean, wearing the insignia of the staff. He carried a leather folder and looked at Hartley with the cold assessment of a man who has already made up his mind. "Lieutenant Hartley," the major began, "you have placed me in a difficult position. Your platoon was ordered to hold Blood Trench 14 for 72 hours. You withdrew after less than 24 and lost more than half your men in the process. This would normally be a clear-cut case for court-martial." Sir, Hartley started, but the major held up his hand. "However, this is not the first time we have had issues with that particular position." The major opened his folder and consulted a document. 3 previous units have experienced similar incidents. Unexplained casualties. Reports of hostile activity that could not be corroborated. Mass desertions. Hartley felt a surge of hope. "Then you believe us? You know something is wrong there." The major's expression did not change. "What I know, Lieutenant, is that Blood Trench 14 has become a morale problem. The men believe it is cursed. They tell stories. These stories spread and undermine discipline across the entire sector. Whether there is any truth to these stories is irrelevant. The perception of truth is doing the damage." He closed the folder. "Blood Trench 14 is being struck from active duty as of this afternoon. The position will be abandoned and the line adjusted to bypass that section entirely. No further units will be assigned there. Officially, this is due to unsustainable casualties from enemy artillery." "And unofficially?" Sergeant Pierce asked quietly. The major met his gaze. "Unofficially, that section of trench will be filled in. Collapsed. Buried. Along with whatever is in it. Some ground is not worth holding regardless of what the maps say." Hartley should have felt relief. Instead, he felt only a creeping dread. Filling in the trench would not destroy what dwelt there. It would only bury it deeper. And the dead had been there long before the British dug their trenches. They had been there for decades, perhaps centuries. A few tons of earth would not stop them. "What about us?" Hartley asked. "What happens to my men?" The major stood. "You and your men will be reassigned to a reserve battalion for rest and evaluation. Your official report will state that you were withdrawn from an untenable position under sustained enemy fire. You lost 13 men to artillery bombardment. There will be no mention of desertion. There will also be no mention of anything else you may have witnessed. Do you understand me, Lieutenant? Hartley understood perfectly. They were being given an out. A way to survive with their reputations intact, on the condition that they never speak publicly about what they had experienced. It was a bargain he would have taken gladly a day ago. But he thought about Private Wilson, sinking into the mud while dozens of hands pulled from below. He thought about Private Dockery, dragged under by things wearing British uniforms. He thought about the 13 men he had lost, and the hundreds who had gone before them. All those deaths would be classified as ordinary military losses. Artillery, enemy raids, the fog of war. And other men would die in other trenches, in other cursed sections of the line, because no one would be allowed to speak the truth. Sir, with respect, Hartley said carefully, men deserve to know what ground they are being asked to hold. They deserve to know if they are being sent to positions that cannot be defended by conventional means. The Major's expression hardened. What men deserve, Lieutenant, and what they can be told are two different things. This war is being fought on many fronts, not all of them visible. Morale is as important as ammunition. If we allow soldiers to believe that some sections of the line are haunted, that the dead rise from the earth, how long before panic spreads through the entire army? How long before wholesale mutiny? Hartley had no answer to that. The Major was not wrong. An army ran on discipline and order. Allowing supernatural explanations for casualties would indeed undermine that order. But it would also condemn more men to die in places like Blood Trench 14, sent in with no warning, no preparation, no understanding of what they truly faced. The Major seemed to read his thoughts. The position is being abandoned, Lieutenant. That is all we can do. Some mysteries cannot be solved with rifles and artillery. They can only be avoided. Be grateful you have survived to accept that lesson. He left without waiting for a response. Hartley and his men were processed out of the forward area that evening, marched back to a rest camp 10 miles behind the lines. They were issued new uniforms, hot food, and orders not to discuss their experience. The army had made its decision. Blood Trench 14 would become a footnote, a section of line quietly removed from the maps. But Hartley knew it was not over. 3 days later, he heard rumors from men recently rotated from the front. The engineers had gone to fill in Blood Trench 14 as ordered. They had brought in trucks full of rubble, hundreds of tons of debris, and dumped it into the position. But when they returned the next morning to verify the work, they found the trench empty again. As if it had never been filled. And now the men said the whole area around the former position was unsafe. People heard digging sounds at night. Sentries in adjacent trenches reported seeing figures moving in the darkness, walking through the barbed wire as if it were not there. The dead were spreading. The cursed ground was growing. Hartley requested an audience with the Major, intending to report these new developments. But the Major had been transferred to another sector. His replacement knew nothing about Blood Trench 14 and made it clear he did not want to know. The matter was closed. The lieutenant and his men were being sent back to their parent unit the following week. They would return to the routine of trench warfare, rotating between the line and the rear, fighting the Germans in the conventional way. But Hartley could not forget. At night he dreamed of mud pulling at his boots. He dreamed of hands reaching up from the earth, of voices calling his name from the darkness. He would wake in a cold sweat, certain for a moment that he was still in Blood Trench 14, surrounded by the dead. The other survivors were no better. Private Sykes had stopped sleeping entirely, terrified of what he might see when he closed his eyes. Sergeant Pierce had developed a nervous habit of checking the ground beneath his feet constantly, as if expecting it to open up and swallow him. They had all been marked by their experience, changed in ways that would never fully heal. On their last night in the rest camp, the 6 survivors gathered in Hartley's tent. They had not discussed Blood Trench 14 since their return, following orders to remain silent. But now, on the eve of their return to duty, they needed to talk about it. To try to make sense of what they had survived. Do you think they are still there? Private Sykes asked quietly. The dead. Do you think they are still in that trench? Hartley considered the question. He thought about the engineer reports, about the impossibility of filling in a trench that emptied itself overnight. He thought about the boundary between the living and the dead wearing thin, about ground poisoned by centuries of violence. Yes, he said finally. They are still there. They will always be there. That ground belongs to them now. Sergeant Pierce nodded slowly. Then we have to make sure no one else gets sent there. We have to warn people even if it costs us our careers. But how? Private Lennox demanded. We have been ordered not to speak of it. If we disobey we will be court-martialed at best, shot at worst. Hartley had been thinking about this problem for days. There was one way to ensure the truth survived even if they did not. One way to make certain that future soldiers would have the knowledge they needed. We write it down, he said. Everything that happened. We create a record. Multiple copies. We send them to different places, different people. Some will be confiscated or destroyed. But some might survive. And someday when this war is over, someone will find them and understand. They worked through the night, writing their account of Blood Trench 14 by candlelight. Each man contributed his memories, his perspective. They did not embellish or exaggerate. They simply described what they had seen, what they had survived. When they finished, they had 3 copies of a document that would probably get them all executed if discovered. But they felt, for the first time since leaving that cursed trench, that they had done something meaningful. They had borne witness. They had refused to let the dead be forgotten or explained away. In the morning they separated the documents. Hartley kept one in his pack. Sergeant Pierce carried another. The third they entrusted to a chaplain who agreed to mail it to Pierce's family in England without reading it. Then they reported for duty and returned to the war. Lieutenant James Hartley was killed 2 months later in an assault on German positions near Passchendaele. He was shot through the chest and died almost instantly. But his body was recovered and buried in a military cemetery, which was more than many men got. The document in his pack was sent home with his personal effects. Sergeant Pierce survived the war but died in the influenza epidemic of 1919, never having spoken publicly about Blood Trench 14. His copy of the account was found among his belongings and kept by his family. The copy sent to England through the chaplain disappeared into military censorship and was not seen again until the 1970s, when it was discovered in a box of classified documents during a routine archival review. By then, everyone involved was long dead. But the story survived. The account of Blood Trench 14 was eventually published in an obscure military history journal, dismissed by most historians as a hoax or the product of shell shock. But soldiers who had served in that sector wrote letters confirming that yes, there had been a trench that was abandoned for unexplained reasons. Yes, men had gone missing there. Yes, the area had been considered cursed. And on certain nights, when the moon is dark and the wind blows across the old battlefield, people still report hearing sounds from that section of ground. Digging sounds. Voices calling out in English and German. The creak of leather and the clink of metal. The sounds of soldiers who do not know they are dead, still holding their position, still waiting for relief that will never come. Blood Trench 14 was never filled in completely. The earth would not allow it. To this day, that section of the old Somme battlefield is avoided by local farmers. Fences make wide detours around it. No one builds there. No one plants there. The ground belongs to the dead, and the dead are possessive of what is theirs. Sometimes after heavy rains the mud shifts and things emerge. Rifles. Helmets. Bones. The local authorities collect them and send them to war museums or burial sites. But they always return. The earth gives them back as if the dead want their possessions close. And on the anniversary of certain battles, people claim to see figures moving through the old no-man's land. Men in khaki and men in gray, walking together in formation, their faces pale and their eyes empty. They march toward Blood Trench 14, stepping down into the earth, disappearing into the mud that has become their eternal garrison. They are still there. They are still on duty. They are still waiting for orders that will never come, holding a position that no longer appears on any map. An army of the dead, forever trapped in the moment of their death, forever bound to the cursed ground that claimed them. And they are always looking for new recruits.